I've got really good news for you. And gentlemen, I'm speaking to you primarily right now. The good news is this: God loves you like crazy, and He wants you to be happy. And He's demonstrated that love to you by giving you gifts. He's given you the gift, first of all, of forgiveness and salvation, and eternal life. That's pretty good. He's given you nature. He's given you health, the ability to earn a living, a place to live. He's given you activities to engage in. And one of the best gifts He's given to you is the gift called marriage. Now, marriage is really neat because when you get married, it means you get to live with a beautiful creation of God called woman. And here's where the news gets really good. You get to have sex with her. High fives all around. This is God's idea. It's His invention. This did not originate in Hollywood. This is God's plan. He designed it to be fun. He designed it to be pleasurable. Now, yes, the Bible does say to be fruitful and multiply and repopulate the earth. May I make an announcement for everyone? That is about the only command of God the entire planet has taken seriously. It has been fulfilled. The world has been populated, all right? So it's not just about population. Marriage is about bonding. And sex is about bonding. It's about pleasure. It's about recreation. It's about activity. It brings two people together. Now, sex is probably the strongest emotional drive in most men's lives when it comes to marriage especially. That is true for about 80 to 85% of men according to some research. There are about 15 to 20% of men for whom sex is no big deal. They can take it or leave it. That's normal for them. That's quite all right. That's natural. But for the vast majority of men, sex is on their mind a lot, and it is a strong emotional drive for them. Ladies, you know all those times you asked your husband, "What are you thinking?" And he said, "Nothing." He was lying. Chances are it was something, because that comes on his mind. Now, some research has been overblown in this, saying that he thinks about this several times a minute. There's really no evidence for that. But he thinks about it far more frequently than you do. And that is true in most cases. This is a strong emotional drive for him. It is a strong need for most men. And if you want to blame someone for that, blame God. He's got 28 times the testosterone in his body as you do as a woman, and that is because of God's design. And so He made him that way. This is God's plan for you. It is a part of the marriage relationship. Now, just to make sure that you know I'm not making all this stuff up, we're going to go to the Bible. And we find this in Genesis chapter 2. God has just created man, and He looks and said, "This is good, but I can't leave him unsupervised." He really needs someone with him. I've kind of created a loose cannon. And obviously I'm laughing about that and making a joke about it, but to some degree there's a ribbon of truth in that. It says, "So the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and he slept. Then He took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that place. The Lord God fashioned into a woman the rib which He had taken from the man and brought her to the man. And the man said, 'Wow!' No, he said, 'This is now bone of my bones and the flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother.'" I want to make that particular point to young adults who have not yet left your parents' home after graduating from college. "Leave father and mother and be joined to his wife." I think King James says cleave. "Joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked, and they were not ashamed." Now, when we read that part about one flesh, every man on the planet says, "I know what that means." And truthfully, you're right, but only partially. One flesh does mean the physical aspect, but it's more than that. It's much, much more than that. In fact, there are other aspects of the relationship that if they are not in place, the one flesh physical portion of it is not what it should be. In fact, let's go to the Bible dictionary to understand a little bit more about one flesh. It is a sign and expression of the inseparable union between husband and wife. This is not only physical, bad news to men, but it's true, but emotional, mental, and spiritual. Now, gentlemen, you need to understand that your wife, in most cases, values the emotional, mental, and spiritual even more than she values the physical. And in fact, if you ask for the physical without having provided the emotional, mental, and spiritual, your wife feels used. She feels cheap and tawdry, and she begins to resent you over your physical touch. But when you provide these other needs and you realize that this is a part of one flesh marriage, this is a part of what it means to be one, then the physical becomes very, very good. This is God's design for you. This is what He's intended for you, that you be one flesh, that one flesh include the sexual part, but is not totally about sex. He wants the two of you to be one. Now understand that these instructions were written and given to people who were primarily in arranged marriages. The Bible has a lot to say about one flesh, about the two becoming one, about becoming, the word we would use today is soulmates. And yet it's written to people in arranged marriages primarily. This whole practice of mate selection by dating and all that, that's a recent sociological phenomena in the West primarily. The vast majority of the world still operates under the system of arranged marriages. That's changing, but that's still the norm. And it was certainly the norm in the days when all this was written. That tells us that one flesh marriage is a choice. It's not that you just happen to one enchanted evening across the crowded room find the right person. It's not just the spark of electricity, because in arranged marriages, they may not know each other when they get married and now, all right, be one flesh. How does that happen? You choose to make it happen. One flesh marriage happens when the two of you choose to share values, goals, beliefs, and practices with those beliefs. It's where you create the big, hairy, audacious ideas and plans and goals of your life, and you work together to accomplish those things. It's where you share every aspect of your relationship, where you are naked and unashamed, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. It's where the two of you truly become one. As I like the way John and Julie Gottman, perhaps the preeminent relationship experts and researchers in the United States and therefore in the world, have put it, is that they describe this kind of marriage as where couples decide to treat each other as best friends and they resolve conflict in kind and gentle ways. That's not a bad description. They decide to treat each other as best friends, a best friend, someone who's always got your back, someone whose back you always have as well, right? Someone who listens to you and doesn't condemn you when you share an emotion or a fear or even something stupid you've done. But always there beside you to hold your hand, to be with you through the ups and the downs of life. You know you can always count on them. They've got your back. They'll defend you. They will tell anyone who's calling you names that, you need to hush up now, because they are with you. There's a gentleness and a kindness that translates between best friends. That's the kind of marriage that is being described here. Best friends. And let me tell you, when you do the best friend thing, everything else begins to fall into place. It falls into place. So how do you do this? The Apostle Paul says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her." There's a lot of talk today about the type of relationship that a marriage should be, and a lot of that talk is taking place in the church about the role of the man versus the woman, and there's a lot of confusion about this. And I'm going to talk about that more even with the next passage. But the truth is that God has called husbands to be head of household, but he never gives privilege without responsibility. He didn't say, by the way, you're the head because I like you best. He said, I'm going to put more on you than you think. You're not the head, first of all, until she says you are. But you're also not the head until you learn to love her as Christ loved the church. How did Christ love the church? How does he love the church? He puts the church first. It's a self-sacrificial love. It's a love that says, you know what? It's not in my best interest, but it's in your best interest that I die for you. Now that is love. And gentlemen, until you're willing to lay down your life for her, you're not following the biblical command. And you don't have one flesh marriage. Her needs, her happiness, her fulfillment, her personal growth needs to be more important to you than your own. And when you demonstrate that, then you're starting to love her as Christ loved the church. This is God's plan. It's where you decide to put her first. Now, again, that goes back to the whole leadership thing. Let's take a look at that again. Mark chapter 10. There's a discussion among the disciples. They're arguing about who's going to be first. And one passage talks about James and John's mother trying to be the good stage mom, saying, I want one of my sons to sit on the left hand and the other on the right hand when you come into your kingdom. And so Jesus now begins to think it's more important that I give them a lesson on leadership than anything else. He said to them, you know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. That sound familiar? But it is not this way among you. That's the command to Christians. Leadership is not this way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. When we think about leadership, we think about the pyramid, with the leader being on top, sending down command, control, orders, right? Exercising of power and authority. That's the leadership model that Jesus said does not belong in Christianity, either in the church, the world, or the home. He takes the pyramid and inverts it. He says, if you want to be the leader, you have to be the servant. How about you have to be the slave of all? And your number one task that morning is not to ask, what can my wife do to make me happy? But what can I do to make her life better? That's what it means to be head of household. You really that excited about the job now? That's what it means to be head of household. And any theology that says the top-down model is right, it just ignores Jesus' every teaching on leadership. Why would it suddenly be different for the home? It's not. In fact, when you exercise power and control, you realize that those are the two elements of every abusive relationship on the planet. Power and control equal abuse. But love and service, that equals love. I'm going to tell you a story at the end of this presentation about my marriage to Gail. We were married for 40 years, and in that 40 years, I never once declared myself to be head of household. I raised 2 daughters, never once declared myself to be head of household. I did my best, imperfectly, to follow this model of leadership, and my wife and children told everyone else I was the head. I never asked for it. I never claimed it. But when you love a woman with this kind of leadership, when you love her as Christ loved the church, and you do this, and then when you love, you decide that you're going to treat each other as best friends and resolve those conflicts in kind and gentle ways, you do something to a woman. You awaken in her a love that she cannot put into words. And no matter how hard you try to give to her, she will always outgive you. Always outgive you. I think women understand love and relationships far more intuitively than men ever do. They get it. They understand what it's about. They know how to make this work. And so when they see someone loving them as Christ loved the church, when they see someone loving them that way, they're willing to give back. It's difficult to find examples of this, though. You don't see very many homes that are operating on this standard, where the husband begins to understand his role, that he is the servant of all, the slave of all, that if anyone's to suffer in the relationship, it needs to be him, not her, not the children, but him. Because he exists for a higher purpose, and that is to serve his family, to support his family, to enable his wife to be. You don't see that often. But when you do, it makes a difference. It makes a huge difference. Years ago, I used to work as a hospice chaplain. And hospice, as you know, is an organization that is dedicated to caring for those who are terminally ill. And there came a woman onto our hospice program named Ruby. Ruby was dying of cancer. And so I went to visit Ruby and her husband Roy. They were both Christians. And I discovered that Ruby and Roy have been married for 67 years. Now that's an amazing thing. 67 years, that's incredible. Wow. I got to talking to them and I realized that they started dating in high school, and in high school they knew that they were going to get married. But Roy was old-fashioned. He said, I'm going to finish college and grad school to get a job, save money and buy a house, make sure we're debt-free. Other than the house, we can still make some house payments before I ask you to marry me. And Ruby trusted him. And they married when Roy was 27 and Ruby was 24. Now you can do the math. They've been married 67 years. Roy is now 94 and Ruby was 91. In those 67 years of marriage, their children could never remember seeing them fight. And in those 67 years, this couple who had done it God's way had never even spent a night apart from each other. Now that's just hard to fathom. But they had never spent a night apart from each other. They were Christians. Ruby was not afraid to die, but she was afraid of dying alone. So when her health got really bad and the hospice nurses thought, we're having some pain we can't control and we think she might die tonight, they brought in a hospital bed and put it in another room of the house. And they called in the family and the children. And since Ruby was afraid of dying alone, they decided that someone would sit up with Ruby all night long. Someone would be by her side 24 hours, the family, until this thing happened. One of the sons volunteered to take the first watch, and Roy went to bed. But you know, after sleeping with this woman for 67 years, you think he could sleep? The guy was tossing and turning like crazy. He couldn't go to sleep. And so he got up and put on his trousers, got his walker, and walked into where his wife was, and his son was sitting there. He said, you might as well go to bed. I can't sleep anyway. So the son went to bed, and Roy sat down next to his wife, turned on the television. And he said, I watched for a little bit, and then I became impressed. It was time to turn the TV off. So I did. And I stood up, and I stood by the bed, and I put my hands on the railing, and I looked down, and I saw my wife. And I just reached down and I took her hand. And when I did, she opened her eyes and looked at me. She smiled. She closed her eyes and died. Just like that. As time passed, I asked him about that situation. I said, so how you dealing with all this? He said, I feel so guilty. I said, guilty? Why? He said, that moment when she died, after 67 years, I should have done something. I should have said something. But instead, I just stood there like a dummy. I said, well, that's one way of looking at it. Maybe there's another way. He said, what do you mean? So let's go back 67 years ago. When you got married, where were you? We were in Cleburne, Texas. Whereabouts? First Christian Church. What were you doing? Standing in the front of the church, sweating profusely. Unair conditioned, it was summer, and I was nervous. Said, what else were you doing? Listening to the preacher. What else? We're holding hands. I said, you were what? We were holding hands. 67 years later, when she died, what were you doing? We were holding hands. I said, Ruby left this relationship the same way she came into it, holding your hand. You think for one moment she would have had it any other way? I guess not, he said. I guess not. I visited Roy through the weeks, and one day I said, all right, 67 years of marriage. Do you have any regrets? He thought. Yeah, I have one. 67 years of marriage and only one regret. I know guys that don't make it 67 days without having more than one regret, all right? This guy, 67 years, only got one regret. I got to know what this is. What's your regret, Roy? I always thought we'd have more time together. Are you kidding me? 67 years of marriage, the last nearly 30 of which he's been retired. They've been together 24/7. They've never spent a night apart, and the one thing that this man wants more than anything else is more time with Ruby. That is intimate marriage. That's what God designed. That's what he wants for you. The physical, yeah, but it's more than that. There's an intimacy involved. that makes life worth living. Now, you and I both know that things have come in that have helped destroy what God had planned, what God has purposed. You know that, I know that. And one of those things is pornography. Now, I say you know that, but some of you know it and some of you don't. Some of you may still think it's no big deal. I've looked at a lot of research on this issue, and the only research that I've ever found that suggests that pornography is not detrimental to marriage, when you research the research, you find out that those were paid for by the porn industry. Every other independent research seems to indicate that this is a problem. So let's take a look at what pornography does. First of all, it damages the brain's pleasure center. Because you get used to going there, with the expectation this is going to be wonderful and it's going to be fulfilling, which is what sex does for you. You go there, you have that, and that pleasure center, the dopamine is released, you feel good. But when you use pornography, there's an element missing, and that is the element of actual human contact. There's no relationship, there's no fulfillment, and so you have an unmet expectation. It changes the chemistry in the brain, which changes the way you think. And you engage in what I call stinking thinking, because it's not smart, it's not right, it is left contact with the reality altogether. Stinking thinking occurs because it changes the brain's chemistry and messes with the pleasure center. It changes the attitude towards the opposite sex. And again, there's all sorts of research on this. All kinds of evidence that demonstrates this to be true. That viewers of pornography have reduced women, and I'm going to speak of this primarily as a male problem, although there's a growing number of women who are engaged with this and finding it a problem as well. But still, the primary consumers of pornography are still men. So I'll speak of it in that respect because it makes it easier for me to do the personal pronouns. All right? But a man who watches pornography begins to view a woman as a commodity to be consumed rather than a person with whom you have a relationship. Because there is no relationship on the screen or with the magazine or anything else that you happen to be watching. And so it reduces them to objects, which means when you objectify them, you have less compassion for them. Which means that even if you're watching television or a movie and there's an act of violence perpetrated by a man against a woman, it's no big deal to you. If I watch that, I get angry, I want to stop it, so I have to change the channel. And that's the normal reaction, by the way, because it's wrong. It is a barrier to intimacy with your spouse and with God. When you've reduced a woman to a commodity, and that you don't have to have her, and you've lost compassion for that individual, even if it's not totally gone, but certainly diminished, there's no intimacy there. There's no sharing. You don't share with the people on the screen, and so you've lost that ability to have that intimacy. You lose it with your spouse, you lose it with God as well, because there's also the result of guilt and shame that comes in for viewers of pornography. They have higher levels of this, and that tends to separate you from God, thinking that this is too big a sin. God's not going to forgive me. I feel shamed of what I'm doing. I hide it. I don't want anybody to know what I'm doing. And so again, it blocks our intimacy with our spouse, and it blocks our intimacy with God. And viewers of pornography have more frequent and more severe depression than those who don't view the material. In fact, when you stop viewing pornography, the frequency and severity of depression will eventually get better. You have fewer incidences and less severe depression. And that, again, has to do with the chemical changes that take place in the brain. And by the way, the chemical changes change your thinking process, which also result in the depression. And the thoughts become more negative, which release more negative chemicals, which means that you have to go to numb it, and the drug of choice very often is pornography, and so the downward cycle just continues and continues and continues. It reduces marital satisfaction and marital fidelity. There was a study done at the University of Indiana which indicated that 6 hours of viewing softcore porn is enough to destroy a man's satisfaction with his marriage. Softcore, 6 hours. There is another study done at Florida State University that demonstrated that there's a direct link between viewing pornography and one's commitment to a relationship. The more pornography you view, the less committed you are to the relationship. Also, the same study, as they continued with the study and doing further studies on it, realized that the chances of marital infidelity increase as you view pornography. It increases as you view pornography. So viewers of pornography are less satisfied with their marriage, with their relationship, and they are more likely to engage in extramarital sex, to violate, therefore, the relationship. And again, viewers of pornography have decreased marital sex. And I have counseled with men who would prefer to watch pornography than to have intercourse with the living, breathing, beautiful spouse who is ready for them, who wants them. And they'd rather watch it on the screen. And the other reason that this produces less sex in the marriage is because at times viewers of pornography want to bring over-the-line activities into the bedroom, and the spouse may not be interested in that, may not be ready for that. And so the man says, well, I can't get what I need from you. And so he withdraws, feels shame, and feels rejected, and goes away and watches more pornography. And so viewers of pornography have less sex than people who don't view pornography. It's kind of a no-brainer to me alone on this particular issue. It places children at risk. If it's in your home, there's a high probability that your children are going to find it. You may think it's password protected. You may think that you got that stash of magazines hidden away, but if it's in there, there's a high risk that your children will find it. And the truth is that the younger a child is when their first exposure comes, the more damaging the effects are upon that child. Most of the people with long-term severe problems with pornography will tell you that they started very young when they found their dad's stash. That's when it started for them. And then it just gets worse and worse. And so the younger a child is, your children are at risk if you're viewing it. They're in the home. There's a high probability that they will find it, and that really does huge damage. And then we're going to say that it's addictive and progressive. Now, I know that there are certain psychologists who claim that anything sexual does not truly qualify as an addiction. I happen to disagree with that. But by addictive, it means that you can't stop. You keep going back to it. And by progressive, we mean that basically you start viewing pornography at a particular level because of the corresponding buzz. But as you continue to view material at this level, the buzz diminishes. In order to get the original buzz, you have to go to more graphic material. And there are studies that have been done 20, 30 years over this, demonstrating this pattern in viewers of pornography. It never stays at the same level. It always gets more progressive, more graphic, until you're viewing material you never dreamed possible for you to view. Again, the research is unmistakable on this. It starts at one level. It never remains at that level. It continues to grow in graphic nature. I remember I used to teach Bible at a Christian high school. A young man who was one of my students. He's a likable kid. But when he graduated, apparently he'd already been involved with this to some degree, but he was really involved in pornography. And again, the progressive nature of this kept going for him until he was caught in a sting operation with child pornography on his computer. And he was being prosecuted for this. And when he got out of jail on bond and he began to talk to his lawyer, he realized he was going to do jail time for this. He was going to do jail time. The shame of that was so overwhelming that my student fled the country, checked into a hotel, and killed himself. He left a number for his sister, so the authorities contacted her. She knew she had to tell their mother, but did not want to do that alone, so she called me. And we went together to tell this woman what had happened to her son. Now, this is an extreme story, but it's not as rare as you might think. This is the natural progression that a lot of viewers of pornography will follow. Not everyone who views it is going to go there. You know that, I know that. But this is where it can head because of the progressive nature of it, of this addiction, and the shame and the guilt and the remorse that this brings to the viewers of this material. But there's good news. There's good news. The fact is that you don't have to stay this way. The fact is that you can find release. Going back to that Florida State University study, they found that just 21 days of sobriety, we're going to call not viewing pornography sobriety because people in the industry who do the recovery work call it that. This is sobriety. I'm getting off my drug of choice, right? 21 days of sobriety begins to reverse all the negative effects. Just 21 days, you begin to reprogram the brain, you get the healthier chemicals in the brain, and you begin at that point to turn the clock back, as it were. And as you quit, incidences of depression decrease, severity of depression decrease, attitudes toward the opposite sex can improve, They can get better. Frequency and satisfaction with marital sex improves. Attitude, on and on it goes. Your children are protected. You can begin to turn it back because God has made an amazing instrument. You see, the biggest sex instrument you have, the biggest sex organ is right between your ears. It is your brain. That's the most important sex organ you possess, whether man or female. And when you engage in stinking thinking, you destroy your sex. You destroy your intimacy, your relationships. You destroy everything. Because stinking thinking robs you of the ability to think logically and to engage in proper relationships. But when you get off of that, you begin to turn that back. And here's how you do it. The Apostle Paul tells us, "Therefore I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God," so it requires him and his mercy to do this, "to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed." How? By the renewing of your mind. Your mind can be renewed. Your mind is renewed. It is renewed by thinking properly, by getting off of the substitute for intimacy, and by changing your thought processes so that you may prove what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. Good, acceptable, and perfect. That's God's desire for you. It is His will for you that you turn back the calendar, you turn back the clock, and you can renew your mind. Help is available. But that help is going to be involving the Holy Spirit, maybe support from around you, maybe some accountability relationships as it begins to change the way you think. Change the way you think. Here's the truth. Pornography is a substitute for the genuine, and it will never truly satisfy. Real intimacy alone brings fulfillment. Real intimacy alone will bring fulfillment. You were intended for intimacy. This is true not just for your relationship's sake, but for another. The Harvard study on longevity in men itemized the different things that help produce longevity in men. Diet and exercise, as you might imagine, were high. But of equal or greater importance for longevity in men was the existence of deep, meaningful relationships, which is one of the reasons why bachelors have a shorter lifespan than do married men. Gentlemen, you may think she's killing you. She's actually toughening you up. She's not killing you. It is the existence of deep, intimate relationships that produce health. The absence of that, and with the negative thinking that we engage in and stinking thinking, it even depresses the body's immune system. You're more susceptible to disease, and you're less likely to live as long. Pornography kills you because it kills the chance of genuine intimacy. You were made for intimacy. The problem is that this is a very difficult thing for men to achieve. Very few men have a lot of intimate relationships. There are a number of reasons for this. One in particular is our society has produced an idea of manhood that does not make it seem manly to share your emotions and to bond in this way. But another one, maybe John Eldridge has hit this on the head when he talks about every man having received a wound when he was young, and usually that wound came from his father. And then if his father does not bestow manhood upon him, you see, manhood is not something you achieve because you turn 21. It's something that is bequeathed to you by another man, and ideally that should be your father. But if your father never told you, you measure up, I believe in you, I'm proud of you, you're a man, either in word or in behavior. If he's never done that in word or deed, most men spend their lives, as Thoreau would say, living lives of quiet desperation. We spend our lives trying to prove that we measure up, but silently believing that we do not. And if you believe that you're living a life of a fraud, you tend to withdraw. You put up protective barriers. You don't let people inside. But getting inside is necessary for intimacy. And so you never tear down that wall. And even your male friends, there's a distance there. Men don't do relationships the same way women do. Women are likely to have numerous intimate relationships with girlfriends, same-sex siblings, and hopefully with you if you're married. But most men will never have a significant, intimate relationship in their life unless they're able to achieve that with their wife. And if you're living with shame and guilt and you've built the walls, you can't go there. And that means that your marriage, your relationships will be unfulfilling, and you're killing your own health, you're killing your mind and your body, you're killing your spirit. There's a need to open up. There's a need for intimacy. You were made for intimacy, and yet it's difficult to achieve. Many of you know that as I've alluded to before, I was married to Gail for 40 years. To be more precise, 40 years, 3 months, 13 days, and 3 hours. Amazing how you find time to do the math when she's gone. And losing her was the most dramatically tragic thing that had ever happened to my life. Gail and I had been close. We had ministered together. We had pastored churches together. We'd traveled the world together. We'd done 121 marriage seminars together, only of the most recent iteration, Mad About Marriage. We'd done some before that together. We had done television programs together, hundreds of TV shows we've done together. We worked together side by side. We raised a family together. We played golf together. We used to joke that neither one of us could afford to die because that would leave the other person completely alone in the world. Well, it was not a joke to me anymore. It was no longer a joke. We had spent an average of 180 days a year on the road, and that means that you don't have the intimate relationships, the connections with friends that you used to have. You still love them, but you're not in touch with their lives. You're home long enough to rinse out your socks and take the next trip. And so when she died, the loneliness that I experienced was just overwhelming. About 7 months in, something happened. There was an experience that I had where God blessed me professionally in a wonderful way. It was some presentations that I was making. And I had to do new material and I couldn't write, so I just studied, and God gave me the words, and I had to do it to camera, so it was done to time. And I stopped. I missed my times by no worse than 2 seconds with 12 sermons. That doesn't happen. No one's that good. And yet I did it. And I thought, oh, this is so good, God. I've got to call and tell. And I realized I had no one to call. No one who would get it. No one who would understand to the depths of their being and rejoice with me, because she was gone. And it then dawned on me that in the entirety of my life, at that point I was 64 years old when this happened, that I had had only one intimate relationship in my entire life, and that was her. And when she was gone, even though God was blessing, even though my family was nearby, even though I could still work and have success, my life was empty. There was no joy. It wasn't just the joy of the loss because of the loneliness. It was the lack of somebody whose heart beat in sympathy with mine. There was no syncing with another human being. The intimacy was gone. I knew I was at risk. I knew I didn't want to live that way. We're not talking suicidal, but I didn't want this. I didn't want it. So I began to plan how I could reach out and at least make friendships. Find some way to have a friendship someplace. Since I'm on the road, it would have to be as much an online friendship. And I got to tell you, men are really bad at this. Men stink at this. So I knew it wasn't going to be with a man. I needed a friendship with a woman, but if she's married, that's really awkward and not healthy. And even with a single woman, there's a danger there because I was now single. And so I decided to start a friendship with someone that Gail and I had met, someone I knew to be theologically simpatico, which is important for me, who lived in Canada. I thought, thank you, Jesus, this is safe. Not so much. I married her. But I tell you, when I began to talk to her online, because that's where our relationship picked up again, when I began to do that, after a while I began to realize that this was someone with whom I could have that same kind of intimacy. It would be different. Her personality is totally different, completely different, and that's probably not a bad thing. But when I realized I could have that with her, I was like a man possessed. I probably should have taken longer, but I was done. I was 64 at the time. I said, who knows how long I got? I'm not wasting it. If I can have that with this woman, I don't want to live the way I'm living. And I pursued her. And fortunately for me, she wanted to be caught. And now I'm building another relationship of intimacy. She travels with me quite often. We have a shared passion for Jesus and for the gospel, a shared passion for ministry. We found ways that our ministries can intersect. And life suddenly takes on a whole new meaning for me. This summer, I just had my 66th birthday. I'm not going to say celebrated it because that's an oxymoron. That just doesn't make sense at this point. It's kind of, well, I made it another year. But at this point in my life, things have changed. And people let me get away with things that they didn't used to let me get away with. And I'm going to take advantage of that right now. Because one of the things people let me get away with is giving unsolicited advice. They figure when you're that old, they can't stop you anyway. So I'm going to give you unsolicited advice. And I'm going to aim it primarily at men because you're the primary consumers of pornography. Life is too bloomin' short to waste it on a cheap substitute. You deserve better. You deserve more. You deserve the best. And it may take some work because you may have to get over the feelings of inferiority that maybe you got from your childhood or your father or wherever else you picked them up from. Every man's got a different story, and every story is just as significant and is all true. You may have to do some work to get over that. And you may have to even seek help with that work, and that's okay. Do it. Do it. And if you've got an issue with this topic of today, if you're dealing with pornography, get help for it because life is too short. I've worked as a hospital and hospice chaplain as well as a pastor, and I've attended well over 500 deaths. And hundreds of times I've had the opportunity to talk to people about their life as they help them get ready for death. And as I've asked them, I've never once had one person say, you know what I really regret is that I hadn't had an affair. Or hadn't watched porn or more porn. No one's ever said, I wish I'd worked longer hours and had more money or bought a better car or had better clothes. No one's ever said any of those things. What they say is, I wish I'd taken better care of my relationship with God. I wish I'd taken care of my marriage and my family. Those are the only things that matter to people who are facing death. When Gail faced death, she didn't have to say, I wish, because she already had. You know, if those things matter at death, maybe they should matter in life. So here's what I'm telling you. Take care of the things that matter. Get rid of the cheap substitute because it is killing you. And it's going to end up in death and destruction. You deserve better. You deserve intimacy with God, with people. You deserve the best. Thank you.